fishery that puts the responsible management of the resource first and foremost. Whether they be based in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia or Arnold's Cove, Newfoundland, our members believe the future of tomorrow is based on the decisions made today. Our members have been part of the groundfish fishery for generations and are deeply passionate about its future. They are family-owned and Indigenous-owned local companies. Collectively, AGC members employ thousands of Atlantic Canadians in primarily year-round jobs, with annual payroll for local employees exceeding $200 million. They spend another $400 million on goods and services from local businesses annually and donate millions to community organizations and charities every year. They provide quality employment opportunities, and those employees are often the heart of rural communities, serving as volunteer firefighters, coaches of youth sports teams, breakfast program volunteers, and the lifeline of many clubs and organizations. AGC members provide economic stability in coastal communities, which often have limited alternative economic opportunities. In terms of the redfish history, the Unit 1 redfish fishery is not a new fishery, neither in policy nor in practice. An ongoing fishery has been conducted at a reduced level according to DFO-defined proportionate quota shares for many years. The offshore sector, which owns and fishes from small, medium, and large boats and operates coastal production plants, developed the commercial redfish fishery. Its historical quota share of Gulf redfish was 78.7%. Stability of quota shares is a key piece for us. Long-established quota sharing arrangements are the foundation of responsible, transparent fisheries management in Canada and are firmly entrenched in current public policy, including for reopening closed fisheries. Where closed fisheries are reopened, the minister will generally respect historic fleet shares, reflecting past participation in and dependency on a particular fishery as the basis for allocations. Stable quota shares enable right-sized harvesting capacity to the resource, help fishers make long-term plans with confidence, promote a conservation ethic to harvest for tomorrow, promote self-reliance, protect investments made in good faith, including by Indigenous groups, facilitate better quality products and economic efficiencies, and provide transparent decision-making. I would note that at the international negotiating table, Canada's position on reopening closed fisheries is clear: to respect existing quota shares. In terms of the decision made by the minister earlier this year, although AGC members have been painted by some as a winner in the decision, these local companies lost 20% of their share and feel that loss deeply. That includes Indigenous license holders from 7 Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador through their 50% ownership of Clearwater Seafoods. These businesses have reinvested tens of millions of dollars in the redfish fishery. They have continuously participated in good faith in the commercial, index, and experimental fisheries since its development going back to the 1950s, based on government's sharing arrangement policy. Looking forward, we respect government's goal of increased Indigenous participation in fisheries and continually express our willingness to help reach those goals. We've also chosen to accept that an almost doubling of quotas for inshore and harvesters in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Quebec comes at our expense. The rebounded redfish stock in the Gulf presents real opportunity for people and communities throughout Atlantic Canada and Quebec. But in a highly competitive global market, industry needs to be equal parts realistic about the opportunity and focused on achieving it together. Our task, the task for industry, is to harvest, process, and market the right-sized redfish to the right markets in the right product form at the right time of year. The more successful industry is at achieving that, the better news for everyone. We have a lot to offer the industry as we move closer to the opening of a commercial redfish fishery. We are familiar with existing and developing markets. We are continuously willing to invest in marketing and sustainable requirements. We have experience harvesting quality redfish in a fleet of vessels that vary in size from 61 feet to 245 feet. Our processing experience is held by local employees, And we already hold MSC sustainability certifications for 5 groundfish species in Atlantic Canada, with another 5 under fishery improvement projects that secure access to many markets. Those efforts borne by the AGC and its member benefit harvesters from all fleet sectors who fish those species. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll now begin with our first round of questions. Go to Mr. Perkins first for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for attending, especially after the technical challenges last time. We appreciate you coming back and appreciate MP Barron's invitation to try and make sure you got a point to present on this important issue. I represent South Shore, Nova Scotia, where some of your members have facilities, Mersey Seafoods, Clearwater. So I'd like to start by asking, there's been a lot of controversy in the discussions about this, and we're still, I believe, waiting for the minister to set the TAC. We haven't actually seen the TAC yet, but I'd like to start by asking a little bit of info on the idea of the historical allocation. There's been controversy saying, well, yeah, it depends which part of history you look at, to the offshore fleet having the percentages you spoke of versus different allocations. Can you provide the committee just a little history from your members' perspective about how they got that percentage and why it's important?
Thank you for the question. We acquired much of our harvesting access in redfish when others were not interested in participating in the redfish fishery because it was either not profitable or very little openness, access in terms of a commercial fishery. So we, other industry participants took shrimp and crab licenses instead of continuing or fishing for redfish. So that is where our participation comes from. It's been over 30, 40 years that we've been involved in this fishery. We've invested heavily in the reopening of a redfish fishery in Unit 1 in terms of processing plants as well as vessels. And we have continually, as I indicated, participated in this fishery, whether it was when it was under moratorium and there was only a test fishery, and then when there was an experimental fishery, and now we look forward to participating in a commercial redfish fishery.
So your members actually paid on the open market commercial rates at the time for that access, when sort of a willing buyer, willing seller sort of terminology wasn't obtained in some sort of surreptitious way or allocation. They paid money for it. They kept the fishery going and continued to try and develop it when others weren't. Do you think it is fair, after all that investment, that those who sold now ask for it back for nothing?
We are very much believers in a willing buyer, willing seller model, whether it be for access by inshore harvesters or Indigenous participants. We feel that it is best left to the industry once the government can state certain objectives for the fishery. We feel that it's best handled by industry to industry or industry to Indigenous discussions and negotiations where everybody is a winner, as opposed to creating an environment where we're creating winners and losers. We feel that, government really has no place in these types of discussions.
So there's been a lot of discussion and sort of confusing testimony, at least to me, around the capacity or the size of the TAC that should be set. Whether the minister has said it's going to be at least 25,000. There's a science that says it looks like that 80,000 metric tons to over 200 could be consumed, or should be, because it's having an impact on other species. If the minister were to set the TAC at the lower end at 25,000, could anyone, whether you're in the inshore or the offshore, actually make a living at it at the current price that redfish is fetching, which I think is about 35 cents a pound?
The markets are very challenging. We've been trying to develop markets for redfish since about 2020 in anticipation of the reopening of Unit 1 redfish in Europe and in Asia and parts of Africa. We face a lot of stiff competition from countries like Norway and Iceland and Russia, who are really selling the larger fish. And I think members know that the fish that we have in Unit 1 is smaller than what the market is looking for. In terms of a total allowable catch, we are comfortable with the floor that the minister has set. Having said that, we understand that other participants in the fishery would like to increase the total allowable catch beyond that 25,000 tons, and we would be comfortable with that. But just recognizing that the higher you go, at least in year 1, there are no markets to extract the maximum value out of this fishery.
Yeah, I mean, I understand from my lobster fishermen, they were paying $1.40 a pound for heads and tails of redfish for bait, but the fish itself is, there's at least in one instance in my community, over 1 million pounds of the fillets through the experimental fishery that's been going on, still in storage, unable to be sold. So if the minister does increase the TAC, how are we going to sell 25,000, let alone 50,000 or whatever number, no matter who catches it? Where's the market for it?
Well, it's probably not in Europe because that is where they are looking at a fish that is much larger in terms of fillets. What we have been exploring are markets in China and Korea where there is consumer interest in eating a whole small fish. So we've been investing quite a bit to try and develop a market there for the whole small redfish. And we've been trying to not market it as a small redfish, but as something that is an alternative to a fish that they would already be familiar with in their own country.
We'll go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So really the question that has been raised has to do with equity in the total allowable catch, who gets what share of it. Traditionally, Nova Scotia has had the largest share, but it's also, according to a chart that I have in front of me, due to see a substantial drop in that share. Is that really the core of the issue that the committee is supposed to be looking at here?
As I say, we've come to accept the decision that's been made by Minister Le Boutillier in terms of reducing our historical share. We strongly believe that those aren't the right decisions to take. People invest based on the shares that they have. Banks lend money to companies based on the shares that they have. And so when access and allocation are destabilized, there are no winners, and it's not a good way to proceed. But as I've said, we've accepted that decision. We hope that going forward, other participants in this fishery will work with us to develop the markets, to extract the maximum value out of this fishery going forward.
Now, we were given information that suggested that there had not been a substantial redfish fishery for about 30 years. So obviously, if catches were available, they would be very constrained. Would this then explain and speak to Mr. Perkins' point that there doesn't seem to be a very robust market for this? So it's the market infrastructure that also has to be, if you like, reestablished to the degree that people will actually make money from this fishery.
The challenge with the fish in Unit 1 is that they've stopped growing. So they're very small. They're about 25 centimeters, where the average size of redfish in the market is 40 centimeters. So that really makes it more challenging to continue to service, let's say, a traditional European market or an American market. And so we really need to find a home for these smaller fish.
What explains actually then, on the one hand, the stock seems to be growing to the point that, a larger fishery is possible. And yet, as you've noted, the fish themselves are smaller. Does science tell us anything about what's going on? Why is the number of fish increasing, yet the size seems to be shrinking? What's happening there? Do you know?
My understanding is that there are too many redfish, and that's what's stunting their growth.
Okay. Now, is there a correlation between the growth in the population of redfish and perhaps challenges with the shrimp fishery?
It's clear that the redfish were eating a lot of shrimp, and certainly changes in the ecosystem, as I understand it, have contributed to the declines in shrimp in the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
So the processing infrastructure is in place. Is that correct? A fish processing plant can handle redfish as easily as it could handle cod or any other species?
We have members that focus solely on redfish as their primary business, so they already have the plants set up to be able to process more redfish. One example is Alain d'Entremont's plant in Digby, which is a relatively new plant, state-of-the-art, fully environmentally friendly, and that plant is capable, as an example, of processing fish. We have also members in Cape Breton, Louisbourg Seafoods, who have the processing capacity, as well as Ocean Choice International in Newfoundland.
So if, in fact, we're trying to look for a market for smaller fish, is there a danger that if we go into that population and catch too many, that those small fish will, those smaller fish won't have a chance to grow to be bigger fish? Or will they actually grow to be bigger fish given, the presence of food, the changes in the water conditions due to climate change, et cetera, et cetera? Are we stuck with smaller fish then off into the foreseeable future?
Certainly sounds like it, both in Unit 1, and we're starting to see a lot of small fish in Unit 2 as well. And the advice that we got this year from Science is that we probably only have about 8 or 10 years to harvest these redfish, because they will just eventually decline back to their normal levels. But we are, I think, we're being told that the fish are not going to grow any larger.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hardy. Left 30 seconds on the clock, but we'll now go to Madam Debian for 6 minutes or less. But I understand Ms. Barron is having some technical troubles in connecting, and she's asked me to give you her 6 minutes, so you have 12 minutes or less.
Merci.
Wow, very generous. Thank you. Thank you. Good day, Madame Lapointe. I'm glad to see you. We've been waiting for you for a while. I'm convinced that you're going to share a lot of information and teach us a lot on the redfish. I believe that you were once with DFO. What was your span of service there? 1999 to 2021. And what was your mandate under different jobs? Well, I was involved in fish management for international markets. I changed positions. I was the assistant to the deputy minister for a while. So I guess you had your hands on all the files eventually, because when we're officially an assistant to a DM, everything comes across the desk. We've heard a lot of concerns and apprehensions as to the return of the offshore fisheries, particularly as it concerns redfish. Given, well, we have to go back 30 years perhaps, but at that time, there had been analysis and evaluations, and conclusions were that the fishing techniques of these offshore ships contributed to the loss of certain, or a radical reduction in certain species, including redfish. Now, you say you have vessels that are 65 to 100 feet, but you don't have anything larger than that in your association. Is that so? Well, there are perhaps 4 to 6, I believe. 2 are active in Newfoundland. One fishes through Nova Scotia waters, over 100 feet, yes. Are bycatch an issue, significant for redfish fisheries? Are there other species that are brought in accidentally in the nets? Well, we do have bycatch of other species. And when the minister makes a decision, I think there'll be new regulations, I think, to try to minimize those bycatch. Perhaps they will be sanctioned a little bit. There are 2 types of redfish. One is can often be captured by a accidental or bycatch situation. It's usually supposed to be a deep water fish, but this one here is not so deep. We're trying to do our best to avoid bycatches in the redfish. Well, cost has been price. We've been told is not very high. It's very poor. So is it true also for bycatch? If you have a lot of haddock, for example, that would be interesting for everybody. It's a better priced fish. Do you think that could be of use? No, I don't think so. The department has put in place various controls to ensure that this type of activity doesn't occur frequently. There'll always be participants who, cut corners a bit and cheat, but no. Can you tell us this 25 million ton, 25% which are allocated to offshore sector? You're representing that economic sector to a degree. Does that mean the rest of the allocation is shared between Indigenous and maybe shrimpers in Quebec, for example, or do they not get a share of that, or they don't have enough, perhaps, so that the shrimpers might get involved in modifying their gear or their vessels to do inshore if their TAC is so low? Is it lucrative enough for a shrimper to go after redfish when the quota is so small for the redfish? Well, 2 observations on that. As for the quota levels, we'd be satisfied with 25,000 tons, but for other sectors, it's not quite as interesting economically if the TAC is only 25,000 tons. So we're flexible on that. I think for the shrimpers, the biggest challenge, of course, would be market access. This is why we'd like to have a collaborative approach with the various participants and stakeholders to maximize the value of the fishery and develop markets together. We've already done the groundwork to get going on that. Well, that's quite interesting. I hope people are listening closely here. There is a fairly serious concern, I believe, in the fisheries sector and in the shrimp fisheries, particular in Quebec, that the techniques, the technology of fishing for offshore is quite destructive. And in fact, if we're going back to the old technology, even if there's newer that's better, Are this historical allocations a first priority to you when we see that we're dealing with a much more complex situation as to the biodiversity? Particularly shrimp is badly impacted. And it's been 5 years that shrimpers have been sounding the alarm, and that the stock of shrimp is just not there anymore, and they have to go after a different fishery, in this instance, redfish. But it's only today that we're announcing the opening of this fishery, or reopening of this fishery, and we're giving the offshore sector a good chunk of the market or the allocation. What do you think of this, respecting the historical allocations as to should they be held to, or it's 30 years has gone by, and perhaps the proportions and ratios should be reconsidered and reviewed, and to reflect the current realities biologically, environmentally? Or do we have to proceed and pick up where we left off 30 years ago? Or should we not review the whole situation? You raised a number of points there. Yes, I know I went a little bit off track and spread my ideas. A few comments, if you will, on the offshore. Compared to what was occurring 30 years ago on offshore, almost that doesn't exist anymore. The methods have really changed, they've evolved, and I don't think it's reasonable to compare the 24 fisheries with that of the 80s. Sustainable fishery is our focus now for all our membership. We have to adopt new practices, better practices for groundfish, certification being one point. We have a Marine Stewardship Council which has set standards. Now, as for historical fishing, redfish continue to be fished in our Unit 1, experimental perhaps, small, limited, and there were very few fishers who decided to participate. So I don't think it's quite fair or equitable to say that there were no opportunities to fish redfish before this year. The opportunities were there, were provided. Our association has taken advantage of that, but there were fewer participants willing to try it out. As for environmental change, if the government has objectives in this sphere to offer other opportunities to shrimpers who have lost a significant amount of their revenue for lack of shrimp, well, tell us what your objectives are, and we'll work together to try to arrive at an equitable win-win situation, rather than have quotas, reductions based on historical data, when the government doesn't really acknowledge the economic impact on our members in the current context and how the details of how the fisheries operate. We're willing to work with every fleet sector. We feel it's imperative to work together to optimize the value of this fisheries. Well, I'm glad to hear that. What would concern me in that line of approach, you're concerned about the viability, of course, of the coastal villages in Gaspésie. All the ships are more or less dry docked, and there's no more fishing going on. But I really hope, well, final question out of my 12 minutes here. At the time of your service in the ministry, in the department, did you feel any pressure or lobbying from the larger enterprises, the offshore, to resume as quickly as possible their fishing activities. It's always been the position of the highliners, the offshore, whether it's redfish or any other species, their priority is to be out there fishing. Now, when I was with the department, we were concentrating on the reopening based on the scientific results. The fish were even smaller at the time, and they were much too small. They couldn't be graded for commercial fishing.
We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes or less, and I'd ask him to keep in mind what I mentioned to him earlier before the meeting started.
Our illustrious chair never ceases to amaze. But it is a pleasure to have you here today, Madame Lapointe. Thank you for taking the time to come and to share with us your insights and expertise. I have a few questions in regards to, with the quota that's been allocated so far, or what's been set aside, how many new fishing jobs in Canada will be created in the offshore fleet sector because of the access to the Unit 1 redfish fishery? Do you know?
As I've indicated, we've always had access and harvested Unit 1 redfish fisheries, so we have already all of our employees, all of our plants in place to continue and to take advantage of the opening of the commercial fishery. So we're not anticipating new employees or new processing plants or new vessels. We've already made those investments.
This would just be to employ existing employees. There'd be no expansion as a result of this. Okay. We talk about the stocks and the health of the stocks of the redfish, some of the challenges that they're facing. In your estimation, are there any other imbalances in the ecosystem that may be affecting the health of the stocks of the redfish?
I'm not a scientific expert, but it certainly seems that in the Gulf, the waters are warming, their ecosystem changes. Just in terms of what I hear on the ground, the fish in Unit 1 is not the same kind of fish or looks the same as it existed many years ago, and as we know, it's much smaller. So there's a lot going on in the environment for sure.
We hear from various, from different stakeholders that obviously it's what is affecting a lot of fish stocks in that area and throughout the Atlantic coast is the explosive growth in population of pinnipeds. Do you feel that could be a factor in the health on an ongoing basis, the healthy quota, or I should say healthy stock level of redfish in the Atlantic waters?
There are definitely certain fisheries where seal predation is an important contributor to the fact that they're not recovering, such as cod in the area of 4T. In terms of redfish, I haven't seen anything from the science advice that would lead me to believe that seals are eating redfish, but I'm not an expert in that area.
Yeah, we wonder if there is study going on in regards to that at this point, if they are looking for that. Question further to this, in regards to getting to where we are now with the proposed levels that have been announced, do you sense that there was adequate consultation with both the offshore sector as well as those who are being affected through various means in the inshore sector of fisheries, through various causes? Do you feel there was adequate consultation done in advance of the decision by the minister?
I would say a bigger concern to us is the length of time it's taken not only this minister but her predecessors to make a decision on allocations in this fishery, which has been quite destabilizing for our members who, as I say, have continued to invest in this fishery, and the length of time that it took to actually get a decision was quite problematic from our perspective.
So the delays have had some definite effects on the industry and across the sector is what you're telling us is basically it's been a delayed process? Okay, I believe my colleague, Mr. Arnold, has one question as well he'd like to ask, if we got time there, Mr. Chair. Okay.
Thank you, Madam LaPointe. It sounds like market is the a major stumbling block in this process. What efforts have been made by DFO to promote the marketing of redfish, or what measure or what steps has the government taken to look for and promote new markets for obviously a fishery that has a resource that could be accessed, but we seem to have no markets?
So in terms of the work that's been done on markets for redfish, that's been largely done by the Atlantic Groundfish Council. We've had some funding from the federal government to be able to do that, which started in 2020. We were sort of going down one path in 2020. We were expecting the fish to be larger, so we were looking at trying to develop a market in Europe, trying to position ourselves differently than European redfish, where there's really a lack of consumer confidence in Europe because of the way that they've been mismanaged. That work had to shift when we saw that the fish wasn't getting any bigger, and so that led us to try and develop a brand for Canadian redfish and other groundfish species, working with a communications and promotion marketing agency, both in as well as in China. So we've been focusing largely on China and Korea. China, because they have already a market for whole small fish. So we're trying to position our fish there. And in Korea as well, there is a market for, as a loss leader, they sell whole small fish in restaurants. So we're trying to develop a brand that has a value, because so that it's beneficial from an economic perspective for Canadian fishermen to be able to extract the maximum value out of this fishery.
Mr. Arnold, we'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Ms. LaPointe, could you define Unit 1 for the benefit of the committee? Describe it geographically. What are you referencing?
It's in the Gulf of St. Lawrence?
Just within the Gulf?
Yes.
It's not coastal offshore Nova Scotia or Newfoundland?
No.
It's solely in the Gulf. Okay. And the fleet operates at the size of vessel you described in the Gulf?
We have in the past, but recent years we've been using smaller vessels in Unit 1.
How small?
Could be 45, 65 feet.
Okay, so that was where it was when it was closed down. Okay. I want to go back. I believe it was Mr. Perkins. That's, on the historical fleet share, there's always an argument over historical quotas, because the history tends to be controlled by the period you establish for the historical data. So could you, what was the historical fleet share? Give us a time frame in which the current historical data was accumulated that you're just using now to justify your position.
I can confirm, but I believe it's going back to the 70s, and even through the index and experimental fishery, the department continued to use the existing proportional shares.
And for the benefit of the committee, can you outline, if you can, how the department maintains that data? And where does it access that data from? Is it independent to the department, or are you simply using the data that's provided to you by outside parties?
That's data that's provided to us by the Department of Fisheries.
Again, how did the department accumulate that data?
I would assume based on landings information.
So it's third-party information the department's using?
Through dockside monitoring. That could be partly it, or observer data.
My point is the department does not independently, on its own, source that data. Did they have a testing regime that you're aware of that established the data that you're using?
I'm not sure.
Not sure, okay. My third question would be through you, Chair, a follow-up on questions from Madame Desbiens. The bycatch issue on redfish depends on which side of the fishery you're on, where it may be. Are you aware of the primary bycatch when you're pursuing the red fishery? Could you identify for the committee what should the concern level be, and what species is more at risk of being caught as a bycatch on redfish?
There's Gulf Atlantic halibut, as well as, I believe, witch flounder, some other groundfish species like witch flounder that have rebuilding plans in place.
How could you provide to the committee ways that the large mobile fleet that you represent could mitigate bycatch on the more lucrative halibut that is primarily pursued by inshore fishers?
I mean, the department has talked about separator panels, which we've used in other parts of Atlantic Canada, but are not, they do have impacts on your catch rates. But we are very much focused on fishing redfish in deeper waters, where I understand there's less bycatch issues.
Could you explain how it would minimize bycatch issues simply by being in deeper water?
I'd have to come back to you with some information on that, but I believe that at certain depths, there is less of an issue with respect to bycatch of other species.
Sure. Thank you. Go back. The technology you referenced when you answered earlier about, I believe you said separation doors. What was the terminology you used?
Panels.
Separator panels. Is that new, or is that?
No, that's something that's been used for a while in other parts.
And is it effective?
It can be effective, but as I say, it does have some downsides in terms of reducing catch efficiency of the species that you're directing for.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Morrissey, we'll now go to Madame Desbiens for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to continue on the same line as Mr. Morrissey because it brings something to mind. Now, fisher folk were telling me that the technology used on the high seas, offshore, does in fact result with significant bycatch. Not 35 cents a pound for redfish, but I mean, some of this bycatch is worth $4 or $5 a pound. Now, you're saying that the technology has changed quite a bit, 30 years? So offshore, which is bottom taking, trawling perhaps, how can it reduce bycatch? Well, we have members that are concentrating on catching redfish. And as for the vessels and the processing, for example, there's a lot of vertical integration. And we can get a value from that redfish. It's just not accessible to those who are organized differently. They're not vertically integrated. We have no interest to go after fisheries that would be bypassed. What do? Do you toss them back in, catch and release? No, but we establish minima. And I'm sure that there will be limits set, but how can you ensure a minimum? You only know it once you've brought the nets aboard. Well, I can give you more of that in writing, if you will, a little later. I can't do it off the top right now today. Okay, would appreciate that. Yes, please. I think my time's elapsed.
Again, we're going to suspend for a moment. I think Ms. Barron is trying to sign in, so we have to do a sound check with her. So we'll suspend for a moment while we're doing that, and then we'll get back to our list. I'll come in and sub in for Ms. Barron, but instead of waiting for that, I'll go on to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes, and then hopefully he's here then to do the 2.5 for Ms. Barron. Mr. Perkins, when you're up, 5 minutes or less, please.
Just got the cheese, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Callaway.
He's good to go now.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. Back in February, I believe, is when the minister made the announcement of the reallocation between the fleets. And I've got a copy of the presentation, I think, that was made to industry groups back then. And I just want to probe something you mentioned earlier when you were being asked about the fleet size that you're using in the Gulf right now. If I understand it correctly, the 58% share is allocated, though, the way it's been done, to a fleet over 100 feet. So when the minister sets the TAC at whatever level she does, and the season begins in the fall, I think, or June. No, I think she said June was the when they were hoping to do it, so we expect it soon. When they do that, then does that mean your members will have to fish with vessels over 100 feet, not the ones you're using now?
No. We are called the offshore sector because we have licenses for vessels over 100 feet, but in actual fact, we only have between 4 and 6 vessels that are actually over 100 feet. The majority of our vessels are much smaller.
So that's important because, of course, there's been some testimony in this committee saying that we've got these big sort of process at sea vessels that are going to vacuum up the redfish in the offshore with this quota, bring it in, and they don't actually create any jobs on land, that they're not bringing back to processing plants, that it's all done in these large vessels. But if you're fishing in a 45-foot vessel to a 60-foot vessel, most of that is being landed and processed on a plant, which is creating those jobs you referred to earlier as well, right?
Our members are actually located in 30 small communities across Atlantic Canada, and we employ Canadians. We contribute to coastal communities. Our employees live in coastal communities. And even if we have some large vessels that freeze, that is a plant that is the same as a land-based plant, but it's on water and it's employing local Atlantic Canadians.
Right now, the intent, depending on obviously the level of the TAC, is that you'll probably be maintaining, I think, the current size fleet for fishing this in the Gulf, that being the one that you referenced earlier, not the greater than 100 foot? Or will it be both?
It could be both. It depends on the economics of it. And certainly I think the department has confirmed that there's never been a policy that's been in place that would not allow a vessel over 100 feet into the Gulf.
I think there's some impression that gets left when people talk about larger vessels and those that have bought these licenses up over the open market over the years since 1995, that somehow these are some sort of big foreign nasty corporate entities that are owned from somewhere outside of Canada, or they're owned by somebody in some company in Toronto. They're not big anonymous corporations, are they? They're family businesses for the most part, are they not?
These are family local businesses based in small communities across Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And just in terms of a large vessel, I think we would argue that a larger vessel spends much less time on the water, much more efficient. And so in terms of the impacts that you're having on the environment and the ecosystem is much less than some smaller boats.
In that, this document that was released is where some confusions come, because it does say an annual catch rate could be considered between 88 and 318 kilotons, I think it is. Now, is that annually, or is that just a one-time only? Because I seem to have at least heard conflicting testimony about whether people think that would be, let's say you set it at 88, that you would be able to do that each year for the next number of years, or is that just that's all you can take, and then the biomass is down to its limit and we stop fishing again.
That advice, I believe, is for 1 year.
1 year. But 1 year, but then there would be a new
There'd be a new assessment.
next year.
Yes, and new advice provided to the minister.
So at some level, when you take out some over time, that should mean the redfish should get larger, right? Because with the lower biomass, there's more food for them, for each fish.
I'm not sure that's what the science advice is saying. I think they're predicting that it's likely to be very small going forward, and that in actual fact, it will the size of the stock will be much smaller in about 8 or 10 years.
No matter what.
No matter what.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll go back now to Mr. Boulouris for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madame Lapointe, for helping us out today. Been a lot of changes on the other side since the last time. Over the past 10 years, your organization or various organizations who fish in the St. Lawrence Gulf have experienced a lot of changes in the fisheries. Generally speaking, do you think that the situation is deteriorated or ameliorated for the employment situation? Could you... a lot of people participate in the industry over the past years, that the environment has changed, the milieu has changed, and this has had an impact on fisheries. Do you think we've been able to maintain same levels of employment? Well, yes, but for various species, the environment does. But for groundfish, cod, for example, in various locations, is only now starting to rebuild itself. And many of our members have had more success with shrimp and crab rather than finfish. Well, I saw a report this morning in the media that the acidification of the waters of the estuary in the Gulf and a drastic lowering of the oxygen content of the water columns have made an impact on the fisheries. Yes, definitely. There are significant disruptions of the environment in that area. And for the proliferation of a certain species, do you think this would have a continuing impact in the coming years? Yes, I suppose, but I'm not an expert in that matter.
Off now for approximately 2.5 minutes with Mr. Hardy. We'll finish our first hour and then go in camera. 2.5 minutes, Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Lapointe, for being with us today. I'm from the West Coast, and one of the issues that we have, particularly with our salmon stocks, is the interception of migrating salmon by international fishers, notably Alaska. I have to put that on the record. Is the intercept out in the deeper water an issue here for the stocks in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or do they mostly just hang around the Gulf?
There is some overlap between redfish in Unit 1 and Unit 2, where I think I indicated we're starting to see some smaller fish there. But generally, they're pretty contained. Okay. It would appear then that the overall strategy is to open up a redfish fishery in order to reduce the size of the stock and take the pressure off shrimp, which are a far more valuable harvest. Is that a reasonable assumption? I think that's a reasonable assumption for those who fish shrimp. We are interested in harvesting redfish because we have a history and a tradition of harvesting it, and we want to be able to sell it and maximize employment and economic opportunities for our members and coastal communities. You did indicate a little bit earlier, though, that there was perhaps just a few years of any kind of a viable harvest in redfish. So are we then dealing with
the proposition that some sort of government assistance is going to be required or some sort of other major transition for the redfish fishery is in the offing, because it would appear that even at its best, this is a very precarious undertaking.
I can't speak to that. I don't think that's an issue for our members. We have, as I say, always participated in a redfish fishery, whether it's as big as it is now or whether it's much more limited.
Right. Well, wish you all the best, and hope that things change, conditions change. Maybe that redfish fishery can be recovered to the point where it's an ongoing and decent, decent source of income for families on the East Coast. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, and I want to say thank you to Madame Lapointe for her appearance here today before committee and sharing her knowledge with us as we look at doing this particular study or report. We will now suspend to go to in camera for our second hour of committee business. Suspended.